Hello, I'm Caroline Fairchild, and welcome to Working Together Live, a show about equity in the workplace with the leaders changing the face of business. The pandemic continues to have an outside impact on working parents who, 2 years into this crisis, still feel like they can't return to any semblance of normalcy. What can employers do to create parents-first workplaces? Joining me now to discuss is Sarahjane Sacchetti. She is the CEO of Clio, which is a platform that supports working parents, and it's used by Pinterest, Salesforce, PepsiCo, and more. Prior to joining Clio, Sarahjane was the Chief Marketing Officer at Collective Health and the Head of Marketing for Formspring. She got her BA in Political Communications from New York University. Sarahjane, welcome to Working Together Live.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's great to be here. And I cannot believe that I'm 2 years in this pandemic. We are still having this conversation and working parents are just still struggling so much. So we so appreciate you being here. I know that we have a lot of working parents, I'm sure, joining us in the stream right now who are happy and eager to hear your solutions and hope that their managers hear them as well. Let's just start by unpacking Clio for us. What exactly is it? What does the company do?
Absolutely. Clio's 6 years into our journey. So to your point of being impatient of talking about this for the past 2 years, we've been talking about it for a little bit longer and are just as impatient now more than ever. Clio's a working family support system. So we support everything from the career, health, and parenting demands of families now actually across the globe. We reach over 1 million families. We support actually families in 65 countries today. And our team is really empowered to support everything that comes up from planning a family through the process of selecting childcare, your children's school, children's mental health, and beyond. And most importantly, figuring out how to integrate these two worlds of life and work, which is, of course, incredibly pertinent today more than ever.
Incredibly pertinent, and a lot of companies are trying to figure that out. But let's unpack this just a little bit more. I'm Salesforce, I'm Pinterest. I decide that my employees are now going to gain access to Clio. What exactly would that look like on the ground?
Absolutely. Clio's actually offered as a benefit. So if you think about, your traditional, what I think of dependent care benefits from, let's say, the last 2 or 3 decades, Clio now sits at what I would say is the forefront of how benefits are changing and supporting not just the health or episodic healthcare needs of members, but actually looking at what's their experience as an employee and where are the biggest gaps, to your point, of equity, health, or access across their population. Interestingly, Salesforce and Pinterest are 2 clients who've been with us well before the pandemic, and they've offered Clio across their workforces to support them in creating families, actually becoming parents, which is a wild moment in our lives where a lot of our identities change and a lot of our demands at work and home really start to be in conflict with one another, as well as through the childhood years. And so both of those companies are offering us as a fully covered benefit. And their members get to talk to who we call Clio Guides, who are an incredible global organization of our employees who support everything from healthy sleep patterns, healthy parenting patterns, identifying high risk, either behaviors or health needs of children, and then actually helping solve them, whether it's helping them navigate the systems that are already out there, or actually giving them our specialist support. We have everything from lactation specialists to childcare specialists to help solve a lot of what I call the million paper cuts that come up between life and work for families.
And I know I saw some research that came out earlier this week that shows that more employees are expecting these kind of benefits from their employer, particularly at this point in the pandemic. But as I listen to you talk, I'm sure there are some naysayers who are joining us in the stream who are questioning, why is this a company's decision to solve? This seems like pretty personal matters. What's your take in terms of why companies need to be thinking about this for their employees?
It is such a good question. So if we back up, here's a couple things to think about. First, your workforce, if you are a manager, a leader, a CEO, 40% of them plus are parents. And then, of course, in that parent group, you see a high percentage of them are your senior managers, leaders, and executives. So first, I would say you have to focus on parents as an identity group. And then beneath that, as you peel that onion back, you have to look at what are some of the leading indicators and failure points that are driving your attrition. that are driving your ability to retain and attract that top talent. And then, of course, that drive the presenteeism, the productivity, and the health of those families that are already in your workforce. So I'd say it's an imperative for us to think about these things because it's a huge part, not just of our employee populations, but it's a huge part of our senior management and up. So it's really an expensive area to focus on it when you think about that identity group. And then the second layer of it is, sadly, it took a pandemic and Zoom calls for us to wake up to this fact, but parents have not just been in trouble through the pandemic. We're not just seeing women leave the workforce in droves. Now we were actually seeing massive amounts of burnout with parents, and we were seeing failures in everything from maternal health outcomes to childcare and finding affordable childcare to women being held back because we take on the majority of these caregiver burdens at home. And so I would say to the naysayers that data supports the argument that actually taking care of one of the most at-risk members of your population is going to be better business for you.
Absolutely. And I want to get into some of that burnout. We have some data that I want to bring up from McKinsey pointing to just how severe the burnout is for parents versus non-parents during COVID-19. So if you look at this, I mean, that's a big difference. So this is looking at the demands, like how many parents versus non-parents said the demands of my work interfere with my private and family life. 73% of parents said yes to this, as opposed to 38% of non-parents. Sarahjane, to your point, this is not a new issue, but how has the pandemic put these issues into the light? What are you hearing from employers in terms of why they want to solve this problem and solve this problem now?
I think three things. So as I shared earlier, Clio's been at this for 6 years. And so thankfully, there were many employers who were showing up to solve these gaps well before the pandemic. But a few things we saw during the pandemic, and I'll put an optimistic tone on them. Number one, employers of all stripes, sizes, and verticals are looking at this. So there's reason to be optimistic. We've brought some really diverse employers into the mix at Clio. Groups you mentioned, Salesforce and Pinterest. They're really known for what I would call talent wars and making sure that their benefits are, at the highest level of benchmark. But then we have actually lower margin businesses like PepsiCo and others. Equinox Gyms is actually, we're really proud to say they're now supporting all of their employees, not just corporate employees with Clio. So I'd say number one, employers are paying attention. And I think a recent study from Willis Towers Watson said 77% of employers are thinking about family forward benefits in the next 3 years. So that's one thing that's changed. The second thing that's changed is really interesting is there's a focus not just on the episode of becoming a parent or the episode of pregnancy and fertility, which I know you and your guests have talked about in the past. We're now actually talking about the health and support of parents of older children. And that's a huge shift that I think we actually owe to the pandemic for showing us that it wasn't just around becoming a parent. It wasn't just about your healthcare episodes. It's actually about all of what I would call that longitudinal support need across a growing family, pediatric mental health, navigating support around a neurodiverse child, acute conditions within a family, finding affordable childcare. These are things that go well beyond those early years of parenthood. And we're really lucky that a few of our clients actually supported us in building what we call our kids product that supports kids up to 12 during the pandemic. And the third I'd say is that parents want more, as you've seen, flexibility in where they live, in how we work. They also want that in their benefits. And so it's been really exciting to see how we've had our member families lean into what we would think of as digital experiences. Incredibly, we have lactation support over Zoom and over an app. We see parents leaning into birth prep, childcare support, group classes in this technology landscape that I think we owe in some ways to this period of time that's pushed us there, but it gives us a lot more scale and also accessibility for parents who are all over the globe today. So those are three trends that we are watching really closely.
All over the globe. And to your point, this isn't something that is a minority stakeholdership in corporate America, if you will. 40% of workers are parents. What are some of the biases that existed against parents that allowed employers for so long not to offer these benefits, not to enter into these discussions with their workers and kind of say, figure this out when you're not working for me?
All right, I'm just going to be very direct. It's Thursday. It's almost the end of the week. I'll be very honest. I think the number one bias is lived experience, right? So, a few years ago, I think it was the Forbes 100 celebrated that 7% of Fortune 100 CEOs were women. And I think number one is that we just don't have enough representation of parents of children and young children who are actually battling out these needs in the C-suite. So I think part of it is representation, which we know in the world of inclusion and diversity is really important to make sure that leadership teams represent who your workforce is and what their needs are. I think second, a lot of these areas don't have data behind them. So to give employers the benefit of the doubt, our HRS systems, our healthcare files often aren't measuring things like burnout or parental stress. And oftentimes employers don't even know how many dependents are typical among their working families. They're hard to define. So I'd say it's kind of a mix of both representation and also a lack of data. And I think on both sides, we're seeing huge progress and have to push for more.
Absolutely. And let's talk about some of that progress. I see a comment here from Delphine in the stream. They're saying one good thing about working from home is that most workers no longer have to hide that they have kids. We were talking about how that's been a boon for working parents and thinking that employers can't just ignore that parents are parents and they have responsibilities outside of work as well. But when I think about hybrid work, when I think about flexible work, I think back to studies that we did prior to the pandemic where women were saying, particularly working mothers, flexibility is the number one perk that I want to have. And now we're in this world of hybrid for a lot of knowledge workers, and there's still some bumps in the road. Is hybrid work a one-size-fits-all solution to supporting working parents? And where are some of those bumps that still exist as companies figure out what the new normal looks like?
I think there's a lot to unpack there. And I think we're going to learn so much, especially now as many of our regions are getting into recovery mode in 2022. A couple of things that stand out about the demand for flexibility. I think we got loud and saw this opportunity to actually, I'll speak personally as a CEO who's a mom of a 5.5 and an 8.5-year-old, right? Actually be able to see our families, maybe participate in pickup or drop off once in a while during the pandemic. And I think that created so much more support and health and optimism in so many working families. And people want to keep that. And so I think employers need to understand their workforce better there. I think secondly, it also created some relief for this massive childcare gap, right? We don't have a social safety net when it comes to working families. And the ability to work from home has given a lot of families a more affordable reality when it comes to patching together childcare and being able to be home and maybe do pickup and actually not have to struggle making ends meet. So those are two things I think we should learn from the pandemic and understand. But I do think working families are going to be at the top of the list when it comes to folks who aren't going to want to go back into the office. I know your studies have shown that. We see that in our own population. 70% of Clio's employees are women. And we actually, of course, based on our mission, have a lot of working families, including in our exec team. And we talk about this constantly. How do we recreate the workforce ourselves? And flexibility and remote work are key to all of that success.
Flexibility, remote work, but these are things the companies can control. But as you just mentioned, there is no real safety net from a policy perspective when it comes to support for working parents. I'm thinking of President Biden's push for paid family leave that got chopped off of the agenda last year. What was your reaction to that? And how do you feel like policy and corporate employers need to work together in order to create solutions for working parents?
Long term, I underscore and support all of the efforts going into creating a true infrastructure and national paid leave policy for the US. With that aside, my reaction was that I wasn't surprised at all. I think employers and managers and certainly parents ourselves have known for a very long time that we can't wait for policymakers to get the ink on a new bill. We actually have had to make things work ourselves. In fact, if you look back at employers, it was in the 1980s where we started to see employers start to cover, some form of daycare spend or child care stipend for employees for good reason, right? That's when we were starting to see more and more women enter the workforce full time. And so I think this is yet a new era for us, but it's the same problem, which is employers are called into patching this together for employees, and employers who want to have inclusive and diverse workforces have figured out that they have to support these needs, and they actually have to make sure their benefits are keeping up with the drastic gaps that so many families face.
Right. This is becoming almost like a talent competition in essence, as more employees look for these benefits when they are seeking out employment. So I agree with you that the trends are working in the right direction. I want to bring in some of the members who are joining us in the stream. We have Antonio, who's saying we wouldn't be having this discussion if U.S. companies followed the European model on parent support. That is very true. Helena says parents want flexibility. The pandemic situation shows us that work-life balance is super important. And Sarah joins in saying it absolutely needs to be a private and public solution. Paid family leave can't just be a luxury for the upper class. So Sarah, Antonio, and Helena, thanks for joining us here. Sarahjane, I'd be remiss not to ask you about your personal experience running Clio during this pandemic with a 5 and 8, or when this started, even younger than that, working from home. What was that like for you? What were some of the lessons that you learned in that process that fueled how you're thinking about Clio's growth?
The smile is hiding pain. It was a wild time. I actually took the role of CEO of Clio from our previous co-founder and CEO in December of 2019. So it was a crash course, and certainly being a first-time CEO during this wild global pandemic. It was painful. I would say that the biggest thing that kept me going was that Clio is actually supporting and solving the issue. So interestingly, as we were going through this massive pain point, we were also being called to solve the pain point for our member families. So it was truly this Rubik's Cube every day. So while it was incredibly difficult, it was also very motivating and very grounding, because it felt so meaningful to solve the problems in any way we could. That said, those were really dark, long days.
Right.
And, I mentioned to you earlier that my kids are at school.
Thankfully, back to school.
And so, right, I think we see this light at the end of the tunnel, but I also think what we've seen is, right, the marks of that period of time, not just on the trends and why you support working families, but also on the scars that are left and how we need to address them in the next 3 to 5 years, are still really present with us.
Absolutely. Sarahjane, listening to you talk, I wonder if there was a moment, perhaps a headline, perhaps a personal experience that you had at the beginning of the pandemic where you felt like you really understood the impact that this crisis was going to uniquely have on working parents. I think back to March of 2020, and I remember thinking to myself, I'm not going to have anything to write about. This is not going to impact, how is this going to impact women at work? And I feel very stupid for having thought that 2 years ago. What was your moment where you thought, okay, this is unique. This is something that parents are really going to feel disproportionately?
It was the day we lost childcare, and made the decision that it wasn't safe for our incredible childcare provider or our family to have her there. And the realization that it wasn't going to end. I think in the beginning, to your point, there was a bit of, we were in a health crisis. And then it became a social crisis. And so I think it was living through that and figuring out, with 2 very young kids at home, how I could lead a really critically needed company and service through that period of time. So there wasn't a headline. I didn't need to look outward. It was literally in my living room, in my bedroom, in my kitchen. It was in front of me. And then the second thing really was, it was interesting, to your point. We were so focused at the time before the pandemic on what I would call kind of the travesty of maternal health in America, particularly Black maternal health. And we still are. And it was this really interesting realization that as we focused on these new parents and going through becoming a parent, that we were going to get pulled into many more directions of the mess that was already there for parents of older kids. And so that was a big shift for us as a product, as a company, I think as an industry, and it hasn't gone away. So that was definitely the moment.
Absolutely. We have a good question here from Miranda. She's asking, how can companies mitigate bias when building COVID-related working parent benefits to ensure that employees who don't have or choose not to have kids are also supported?
It's such a good question. It's one that a lot of our most sophisticated clients, who are oftentimes global benefits leader or HR leader ask us. And I can't say who said this, but one of our most sophisticated Fortune 50 clients actually put it well when I asked her, how do you communicate to your employee base that this is for parents and not for others? And she put it really eloquently. She said her belief as a leader in benefits is to ensure equity and make sure that everyone gets to start at the same starting line of the race. And her belief was because, to your point on burnout, you showed the stat earlier of 70% versus 30% parents, non-parents, and then you look at the health outcomes, et cetera, that her belief was that this was about equity in the workforce and investing in this identity group, if you will, was one of the small things that they as an employer could do to start to balance out that, ensure that everyone had the same starting line. I think it's an incredibly important question. And I would also liken it to mental health benefits, right? We should never stigmatize and say, well, why does one group get that mental health access or not? We should really ensure that we're supporting all of the folks in our workforce, and particularly those who are most disenfranchised. And I think parents, particularly single parents and women of color who are parents, and all parents are really marginalized in so many ways in the workforce today.
And that really gets me to this question around, I'm thinking about maybe some of the managers who are joining us in the stream right now, listening to this discussion. What are the signs that parents are burning out in your workforce? I'm going to bring up some stats we have from Catalyst that show just how much COVID-19 has impacted parents' experiences at work. 45% have had to revise career goals, ambitions. 43% have been unable to perform optimally. 42% feel disconnected from their organization. I work for a pretty great company. Sarahjane, LinkedIn, I think, is one of the best. And I've never been asked these questions explicitly. So I'm wondering how companies can see or measure the true impact in terms of burnout, how parents are feeling. What are some of the signs?
I think, it's hard to measure these things and also know that you're going to get an honest response. I think some larger companies are using their ERGs or identity groups really well in this time to start to get that pulse check. But it's not a bad time as a leader or manager to have those open conversations at the front line of leading your business, of how are you doing? Asking specific questions like, do you have childcare set up? Are you having any issues? Is it getting in the way? To that earlier point you made about kind of the private versus workforce life, I think as managers and leaders, we have to make sure that people can come to us with areas of their lives that maybe we used to think didn't come to the workforce. So that's just a tip there. And interestingly, when you showed those stats, it made me remember that in the counter argument, in the reverse, 57% of our working mothers who have Clio have said we've saved them from thinking about leaving their organization or taking a step back. So I think it's, to your point, finding ways to ask those questions, and also knowing that the data may not tell you everything, but you see this systemically throughout our population. And so I would just say, I think you can assume that most of your working families and working parents are having a hard time.
It's a simple solution, but just asking the questions really can go a long way.
Totally. And making sure it's relatable and that you have a bias-free conversation where people feel like they can come to work and talk about it. My favorite part of our Zooms at Clio, especially when we do all hands, is how many babies and young children are in our Zooms. Of course, you would expect that from a company with a mission to make working families thrive. But I think it's also, how do you find and make space for that in your own teams? Even in a small team, that can go a long way.
I have a colleague who is just returning from maternity leave in Australia, and there's a meeting that I have with her every Monday, and her son sits right next to her, and it's one of the highlights of my week, having that meeting with her as well as him. So I agree with that sentiment. This brings me to a comment here from Connie. She's saying that they had to take extended time off for the first time in their career after experiencing burnout. This gets me to career breaks, which is something that working mothers, working women experience at a higher rate than their male peers, particularly around the times that they have children. How do we reduce the stigma of career breaks, both when we're trying to bring women back into the workforce, but also as we're thinking about policies and programs like Clio that are supporting working parents throughout the evolution of them having children?
Absolutely. I think it comes to manager training and taking it seriously. I think we've done some early I'll call it preliminary work when it comes to inclusion and diversity training. And I think this should be key to it is, are you a bias-free workforce? And if you want to see your numbers change, if you want to see more women at the top of your company, if you want to see more women who, Black women at the top of your company, if you want to see more LGBTQ, dads at the top of your company, you have to change how you actually look at your pipeline and your recruiting. So beyond, giving incredible benefits like Clio, I think that it's really time for people to stop saying they have a pipeline problem when it comes to recruiting. And to your point, open up the aperture of why is that? Are you actually creating bias by not putting forward candidates who might have missed years or gap years in their resumes? And I think it's something we have to talk about and get loud about, because I think the candidate is sitting there that may not pass through your recruiter screens, and you have to be a lot smarter and more thoughtful about getting to your goals on inclusion and diversity and change some of what I would call those norms or gates that are in too many of our recruiting funnels.
Well, the good news is here at LinkedIn, we did some surveys on exactly this. And we found that while a lot of women fear that there is this stigma around career breaks, hiring managers are telling us, recruiters are telling us that they don't think there's a stigma. And particularly after this pandemic, when so many people had to take time off like Connie, recruiters and hiring managers are looking at that career break and not necessarily seeing it as a stumbling stone to getting back at work. So the trends are moving in the right direction. And also to your point, if I hear about the pipeline problem one more time, I'm going to blow my brains out. So
exactly, it's a manager problem.
It is a manager problem. Sarahjane, this has been such a great conversation. I so appreciate you joining us on LinkedIn, on Working Together Live. And I see so many people in this stream, just so thankful for your time. So hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your week.
That was Sarahjane Sacchetti. She is the CEO of Clio, breaking down for us 2 years into this pandemic, how employers can still do a better job of supporting working parents. I want to thank her for joining us on the show. All right, Working Together is not just a live show. It is also a weekly newsletter that hits your inbox every Wednesday morning. For more on equity in the workplace and the leaders changing the face of business, subscribe by clicking the link that my producer is sharing in the stream right as we speak. All right, next week on Working Together Live, we're sitting down with Olivia Owens. She is the general manager of iFund Women of Color. We're going to have a conversation on venture capital and how we can get more capital into the hands of women of color. I'm really looking forward to that conversation. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thanks for joining us on Working Together Live.